the internet by terrorists. Terrorists use the internet for multiple different purposes, and these purposes are not always offensive in nature. Many of the activities of terrorists in cyberspace are directed at accomplishing terrorist goals, and they are not always in the form of violent operations or planning or even planning for violent operations. However, the academic literature on cyber terrorism have been categorizing cyber activities of terrorists into at least three categories. The first one is a restrictive understanding of cyber terrorism. In a restrictive understanding of cyber terrorism is an attack using digital technologies against network and or computers, which result in physical damages and or violence against non-combatants with the aim of spreading fear and creating a propaganda effect. So cyberterrorism denotes the use of internet technology to conduct disruptive or destructive operations in the digital domain so as to create and exploit fear through violence or the threat of violence at the behest of a militant belief system. In a restrictive understanding of cyberterrorism, to qualify as cyberterrorism, a terrorist operation must utilize a digital technology to disrupt digital communication facilities and create enough harm to generate fear and carry a political objective, i.e., intimidate or coerce a government or its people in furtherance of political or social objectives. So in the diagram in the slide here, we can see that in a process of an attack by cyber terrorists in a restrictive understanding, the target here is critical national infrastructure or infrastructure computer system. And the targeting of this critical national information infrastructure computer system leads to mass disruption or seriously interfering a critical services operation, which may cause fear, death, or bodily injury, or severe economic loss. It is also one component of an understanding about cyber terrorism here is the unlawful means or the method of attack. And so we need to understand here that cyber terrorism in a restrictive understanding could only take place in jurisdictions where the use of cyberspace by terrorists is in itself illegal. There are multiple different varieties of laws on the use of cyberspace by bad actors. We call them bad actors. We could be hackers or terrorists or cyber hacktivists. But restrictive legal definition of cyber terrorism is rarely provided in legal products of different countries. Democratic countries usually do not specify the use of cyberspace by terrorists. China, for example, specifically illegalized the use of cyberspace for terrorist activities. The US does not have that kind of legal provision. Indonesia does not have that kind of legal provision. And so terrorist use of cyberspace is like the use of cyberspace by any other legitimate actors. And the second understanding of cyber terrorism is slightly expanded, yet still a restrictive definition of cyber terrorism, which maintains that cyber terrorism takes place by targeting critical infrastructures or banking or financial systems, politically motivated cyber attacks that result in economic losses, chaos, and fear in the society. So in this understanding, in this category of cyber terrorism, there are no kinetic effects, as in bodily injury or deaths, but the attacks conducted by terrorists in cyberspace resulted in chaos in society, huge economic losses, or widespread fear, because this attack is implicating on financial systems or banking, and it create huge economic loss. The final category of cyber terrorism, and this is usually not explicitly categorized as cyber terrorism, but rather cyber terrorist activity, is the use of information and communication technology in cyberspace to facilitate terrorist activities. So it can be propaganda, it can be fundraising, or just simply communication or tactical coordination conducted in cyberspace. In reality, the huge or the majority of terrorist cyber activities is in this third category of cyber activity of terrorism. They are not offensive operations. They are not creating disruptions in the society, but they are facilitating terrorists to maintain their activities and existence. Right. So what are the important elements of cyber terrorism? How do we know when cyber terrorism takes place? We also we certainly we need to look at particular indicators that should be there so that we can categorize particular events as cyber terrorism. Here is a polling conducted by Lee Jervis in 2012 and 2017 on what counts as elements of cyber terrorism. And there are three main components that we can see here. And the first one is political and ideological motive. Political or ideological motive is the main component, the first component that is considered to be the most important among other components of cyber terrorism. It is so because there are multiple different cyber offensive operations taking place in the digital realm, but the ones that can be categorized as cyber terrorism should be driven by an ideological or political motive instead of economic profit kinds of motive. Right, so that's the first. The second one is digital means or target. That means that a cyber terrorism, an event of cyber terrorism, must be indicated by the use of digital means by terrorists targeting other digital means, or a digital network. And so, well, there are varieties of opinions here. There are others who also say that digital means can be used, but targeting non-digital targets. So we are looking at how Digital means are used to gather fundings or recruit members and acquire needed weaponry, but the targets are offline or not in the digital realm. But that's more minority in the sense that there are less people who say that, and there are more people who would argue or have a standpoint that both means and target in cyberterrorism must be digital. And then another component is fear as an outcome. So fear as an outcome is uh, an important component of cyberterrorism. It has to produce fear. Cyberterrorism must produce fear. Uh, uh, we can note here that violence is appearing after fear, right? So if we look at this polling, violence against people or property is not above fear, which means that fear may result even without violence, even without kinetic effect. Fear can be induced digitally by cyber terrorists. Um, Fear can also be induced through threat of use of force. So let's say a digital or cyber terrorist attack um, advertised a possibility or a threat that terrorists may poison uh, a water source of a particular community, and that community takes that advertisement or campaign as something true that will take place, then that will induce fear in the society. So there's no violence there. Um, it may also be the case that a cyber terrorist operation produce disinformation using an AI generated videos or fake videos that induced riots in the society. So we are not looking at cyber terrorism that produce use of force, but actually produce fear or chaos as an outcome. And then there are other components like violence against people or property, criminality or illegality. Criminality or illegality also is also something that is quite pertinent in the survey, meaning that it is important for states to um, formulate laws that particularly govern or criminalize or penalize the use of cyberspace by terrorists. Um, and then there are other components like civilian targets. Civilian targets is a pertinent issue here. There are uh, opinions or surveys that would argue that cyber terrorism is something that only takes place when the targets are civilians. But it is not easy to distinguish between civilian and military targets, particularly and more especially in cyberspace. Because in cyberspace, most of the facilities are run and owned by private sector, private entities, although they may be run at the same time by the military or elements of the military. And then we also look here that the component of non-state perpetrators is has a pretty low ranking in the survey. uh, which suggests that increasingly uh, attacks in cyberspace that are they are politically motivated or ideologically motivated, and then using digital means as vehicle of operation and target of operation, producing fear as an outcome, is not operations that are conducted by non-state perpetrators, but rather by state perpetrators backing a non-state perpetrator. So, what I'm saying was, uh, when state actor is backing a non-state perpetrator. So there's always the presence of the state in the conduct of cyber attacks, uh, significant cyber attacks by non-state perpetrators. All right, now let's turn to the hypothetical scenarios of cyber terrorism. This is still a survey, a result of a survey conducted by Lee Jervis, and we're looking at 6 different scenarios that may or may not be categorized as cyber terrorism. And due to the nature of the survey, uh, we are looking at uh, possibilities that some scenarios are more strongly categorized as cyber terrorism than others. Now, let's take a look at the strongest majority in the survey, and that's scenarios number 1, number 3, and number 4. Now, here, number 1, we look at the scenario where a terrorist group interferes with an air traffic control system, causing 2 passenger aircraft to collide in midair. So what we're looking at here is how a terrorist organization utilizes a digital technology, perhaps some kind of a malware, and it targets another digital network, an air traffic control system, and due to the disruption caused by this malware, 2 passenger aircraft collide in midair. There is an almost unanimous agreement that this scenario constitute cyber terrorism. The respondents here emphasize that in this scenario, the perpetrators had caused a serious physical harm via digital means. Although there is an almost unanimous agreement that scenario 1 is a cyber terrorism, there's still a disagreement or confusion about how terrorist organization interferes with an air traffic control system, because there's also a possibility that interfering with air traffic control system may not require digital means. They could blow it up. They could use incendiary devices or improvised explosive devices that disrupt with their traffic control system. And then there's also thought among the respondents that the terrorist organizations would also need to publicly communicate that they had done the acts that are perpetrated here. And then in scenario 3, we'll look at, that's another unanimous agreement, almost unanimous agreement, that is cyber terrorism. A terrorist organization remotely access the processing control system of a serial manufacturer. It can also be a water purifying system, and changes the level of iron supplement, and as a result, large numbers of children fall ill, some die. Uh, this is also a strong possible scenario of cyber terrorism. Again, as with previous explanation that I've provided before this, we also need to take a look into the motivation of the attack. It should be political, and it is also easier to categorize any one of these acts as acts of terrorism or acts of cyber terrorism even if they are publicly announced by or claimed by the terrorist organization. Claiming and announcing is also a complexity of its own because in a single attack there can be more than one organizations that claim it as their accomplishment. And then we look at scenario 4 is another majority of votes that agree that it is a cyber terrorism. It is where a terrorist group hacks into the computer system of a nation's stock exchange, sending the national economy into chaos and causing significant economic damage. So this is a particularly interesting hypothetical scenario because there are no bodily injury or deaths resulted in this attack, but it produced a huge economic cost and even chaos in the society. It could also result in succession of leadership at the highest political leadership of the country. And so we could say that scenario 4, although does not produce violence or bodily injury or deaths, it produced a significant political impact. Now, there are minor scenarios here that most respondents disagree that it constitutes cyber terrorism. Number 2 is tensions between two communities that boil over, resulting in violent rioting. Several people got killed, and a terrorist group seeks to further inflame the situation, posing as members of one of the communities. They post gruesome images and videos on social media and issue threats against members of the other community. We can see that digital technology is utilized here to its furthest extent, I suppose, in a propagandistic way, where terrorist organizations use the social media and other platforms. I suppose social media is at the moment highly controlled already, and so they could be using other kinds of platforms where there's more freedom and there's less content moderation operation in the platforms, and as a result of disinformation and in these using these platforms, and also we can see here that the terrorist organizations also use AI to create fake videos, and so they can pose as members of one of the communities, posting gruesome images, provoking hatred, provoking chaos in the society, and one group of the society is feel threatened by another. We could say that this is probably, although it doesn't constitute, although most respondents feel that it doesn't constitute cyber terrorism because there's no targeting of a digital network and it doesn't directly implicate on bodily injury and deaths, it does produce catastrophic result. And I think that depending on where this poll is taken, there are others that would say that this scenario number two, is actually constitute cyber terrorism. And then we look at scenario number five: a terrorist group plants a bomb in the computer control room of the nation's stock exchange. No one's killed, the computers are destroyed, sending the national economy into chaos, causing significant economic damage. And so we can see here that there is no digital technology that is utilized by the terrorist at all. And so we could say that this is not even a cyber use of by the terrorists, because it could be it could be the case that the planting of bomb in a computer control room is planned in cyberspace. Now we're probably thinking that way. We're thinking that cyberspace is used to execute to coordinate planning for a conventional terrorist attack using bombs or improvised explosive devices. And indeed, this is when we say it like that, it means that we tend to agree on an expanded, unrestricted understanding of cyber terrorism. Uh, and so it requires one that adopts this kind of definition to also have an expansive or unrestricted control in cyberspace. Usually, states that have this kind of understanding of unrestricted understanding of cyber terrorism, they would devise laws that uh, designate particular individuals, or even designate particular ideologies in cyberspace to be prevented from utilizing it for purposes of conducting attacks. And the last one is where a terrorist group plans to hijack a plane and crash it into a busy urban area. They buy their flight tickets online. Again, this is very expanded definition of cyber terrorism, and the consequence of adopting an expanded definition of cyber terrorism is that responding to it would also require an unrestricted control over the cyberspace that would also erode democracy and freedom of expression in cyberspace. All right, now I want us to take a look at the presence of terrorist organizations in cyberspace. So now there are 331 channels engaged in the distribution of militant Islamist propaganda. They included 99 standalone web pages, 30 social media and micro blog accounts, 152 file sharing services, and there are 50 other means of communication. The Islamic State, Al Qaeda, and the Taliban are keeping up their presence in the cyberspace, conducting propaganda, radicalization, recruitment, and fundraising, as well as planning for possible attacks. This is still excluding terrorist organizations of different ideologies, such as leftists and the ultra nationalists organizations. These terrorist organization, violent extremist organization, are utilizing the ungoverned spaces in the digital realm that are usually present in democratic societies. The presence of violent extremist organizations, or VEO, in the cyberspace is a grave challenge for democracies because they need to democracies need to maintain freedom of expression as well as the security of cyberspace from being exploited by terrorist organizations. If we look at here, the Islamic State maintained the most sophisticated network among all of the violent extremist organizations under consideration. It proved to be affiliated with 130 addresses and accounts. This figure is made up of 28 standalone web pages, 9 social media accounts, 74 file sharing domains, and 19 other means of communication. This was a surprisingly high outcome because there had been a huge amount of attention attached to curbing the Islamic State online presence in recent years. Um, and so we are also looking at multiple different platforms used by the Islamic State, um, mostly file sharing domains. So file sharing platforms have been mostly utilized by ISIS. So the platforms that are used by ISIS is not web pages or social media anymore, but file sharing platform. And so states that are focusing on um, blocking access to web pages, or we generally say blocking web pages, are usually are we can say that they are uh, um, conducting a futile operation because most of the platforms that is used by terrorist organizations at the moment is file sharing platform, not web pages, not social media. ISIS usually utilize standalone website called Elocap number one, constituted an aggregator of both official releases and links leading to other domains and accounts affiliated with Daesh. Elocap number one redirected users to additional incarnations or copies of this web page, Telegram, Rocket Chat, and Tech Heaven channels, blogs, and Internet Archive accounts, as well as to 24 other file sharing services. Overall, as many as 51 addresses and accounts were associated with this domain. Interestingly, outlinks leading to other IS affiliated URLs were usually shared by the group's followers in comments. The large quantity of these comments under each new post also constituted a solid indicator of how popular this web page was. So ISIS has found a new way to maintain their contents in the cyberspace, to outmaneuver state responses in blocking access to websites. So once a website is blocked or once a channel is blocked, another is available as a repository of contents in the blocked website. The detected information ecosystem of Al-Qaeda proved to be much less developed. It consisted of only 12 websites, 3 social media accounts, 13 file sharing services, and 8 communication channels that utilized Arabic, English, and Bengali. Most of the standalone web pages served as universal repositories of propaganda. However, some focused on presenting a single element of Al-Qaeda's agenda, such as Tawhid, We call Tawhid is the oneness of God. Several domains, including Qram, Bayan, and Ghazwa, maintain networks of secondary communication channels consisting of file sharing services and encrypted messaging apps such as Chipwire, and Telegram channels. Popular social media accounts were also linked. Those on Twitter and YouTube were banned, but Facebook profile was still accessible. It was affiliated with a known AQ-linked Saudi cleric and had almost 13,000 followers. A similar network, but only in terms of scale, was maintained by Taliban. Now, when compared to Al-Qaeda, the main difference was that it heavily relied on standalone web pages. 22 standalone web pages that disseminated materials in 5 languages: Pashto, Arabic, English, Urdu, and Dari. The vast majority of them were affiliated with the group's media branch, El Amara Studio. They primarily served as a universal repositories of propaganda productions, including battle footage from Afghanistan, nasheed recordings, and official announcements. So we can see that Taliban relied heavily on web pages, which means that they are not categorized as terrorist organization by most states, and access to their web pages are not blocked, so they're not pushed or driven to use more contemporary platforms because their web pages are still functioning well for them. Thus, we can see that the universal presence of terrorist organization in cyberspace is still significant. As we can see here, hundreds of channels, including web pages, microblog accounts, social media accounts, file sharing services. Some of the still images are captured here in the slide. And 50 other means of communications are run by Al-Qaeda, ISIS, and Taliban. The major limitation of collecting the channels run terrorist organizations in cyberspace is that first, the terrorist organizations are still limited to Islamist organizations. The emerging presence of right-wing extremist organizations in the West and separatist organizations are still unaccounted for due to the fact that many of these organizations are not designated terrorist organizations, including the Taliban. As we can see here, the Taliban has successfully run mostly web pages for their propaganda materials, indicating their relative freedom in cyberspace. So, for what purposes terrorists use the cyberspace for? Much of what terrorists do online is logistical. Information technologies enhance the ability of terrorist groups to plan operations and to develop the resources needed for a campaign. Specifically, just as noted earlier in case of activists or hacktivists, terrorists do a lot of data mining. Data mining essentially taking advantage of the repository nature of the internet to gather intelligence that can be used to strategically and tactically plan operation. More than ever before, terrorist cells are able to compile and organize massive amounts of information of the web for use in planning. Databases available to terrorist groups function much like an information list or a product database might for a private company. They allow individual members to more quickly adapt their behavior while doing their tasks. Terrorist cells can more effectively identify weak spots in security procedures or optimal times for a bombing attack based on information freely available on the web, such as traffic metrics or government published schedules for local government operations. The nature of the internet as a large library also allows terrorist groups to introduce insurance in a way that has rarely been possible before. And then fundraising. Fundraise is conducted in two ways. First, easy access to off-the-shelf methods of encrypting communications and coordinating with foreign counterparts ensures a degree of secrecy in financial interactions between terrorist outfits. Likewise, data mining efforts provide more accurate demographic information about potential sympathizers and citizen funders, which are then relatively easy to contact in discrete ways via the use of the internet, and particularly through darknets, off-the-shelf encrypted messaging applications, etc. And the third one is recruitment and mobilization of support. Recruit and mobilize audience sympathetic to the cause of the terrorist organizations. In some cases, the internet facilitates recruitment of new members simply by allowing for quick communication across long distances. Would-be adherents or supporters are more capable than ever before when it comes to making contact with active terrorist groups. However, the web has also made targeted recruitment across an unbounded geographic area quite simple. Again, data mining efforts allow terrorist groups not only to solicit donations from potential sympathizers, but also to shape sympathizers' worldviews and invite different kinds of participation with the cause. Terrorists that operate on social media, for instance, can customize their informational offering such that those with minimal sympathies become seduced or inured in the narrative of struggle and political change forwarded by the group. Moreover, terrorist groups can promote their own narrative to counter that of governments, thus protecting their access to the demographic that constitutes their potential supporters. Number 4 is coordination of the battlefield or coordination of attack planning. Terrorists can plan attacks with greater precision in timing than ever before and can furthermore effectively adapt plans to evolving circumstances such as unexpected presence of military forces or the move of a crowd might make way from a hidden bomb. Number 5 and number 6, networking to increase cell deterrence and information sharing with counterparts around the world. Networking means not only that groups are more easily able to talk with one another, but also that it is increasingly easy for terrorist groups to fashion themselves as highly decentralized, cell-based organizations. Here the point is that terrorists are more easily able to coordinate various elements of their campaign beyond individual attacks to optimize strategic gains. By sharing information, terrorist groups that are using the internet to their advantage are able to overcome many of the traditional problems of coordination with other extremist groups. Inequalities of capability and talent, uneven access to resources, etc. Terrorists that effectively mine data relevant to their particular domestic situation, for instance, are able to extend the effectiveness of national opposition to the propaganda and engaging in psychological warfare. So for propaganda and engaging in psychological warfare, much as is the case with activists, terrorist use of the internet naturally involves an enhanced ability to speak to audiences distributed both locally and around the world. This allows terrorists to expose relatively large populations to information that they might rarely have been presented with before. Use of social media, email, wiki sites, and more allows terrorists to apply their own frame and method of presentation to information about their cause, hopefully bypassing traditional government and media framing of terrorist efforts to reach sympathetic audiences. Moreover, messaging about terrorist causes need not come directly from known terrorist outlets. The internet both allows for anonymity in publication of information and quite commonly the use of proxy mouthpieces for such a purpose. Diffuse networks of outlets can act to advocate and debate pro-terrorist positions, while terrorists can more directly attempt to psychologically influence populations.